Hi, everyone. It's the Catholic CEO, Henry Katarna. Welcome to this Catholic Business Wisdom series. Topic today, the LLC, the Limited Liability Corporation, or the Business Corporation. This is the main legal structure for most businesses. In the United States, you will call it the Limited Liability Corporation, and most federal and state laws mention that term. In Canada, and many of the Commonwealth countries, you will hear the business corporation or the not-for-profit corporation in the case of a not-for-profit. But generally, the LLC, we'll use that term today. It's the main legal structure for most businesses. The limited liability corporation title is often included as part of the company name. So, for example, we might have XYZ Inc., INC, Incorporated, or you might have XYZ Limited, LTD, which signifies limited liability. And you might have even the word corporation, like Katarna Capital Corporation. It's the legal term signifying that it is a limited liability corporation. And the reason for that term is that it's an official designation that your company is registered in a formal way. And the concept of limited liability is to suggest that there is a limited liability against what, you might ask? Well, it's a firewall. Think of it as a firewall. If somebody sues you and you have a company, they will generally sue the company, and therefore you are not personally liable for it because it's the corporation, which under the law is a person. So a limited liability corporation is a person under the law, and therefore it can be sued, it can contract, it can do things in its own name, as opposed to an individual who can also do things in his or her own name and be sued and contract and do all these sorts of things. But the limited liability concept is that liability is limited to the corporation itself, and it does not extend generally to yourself. Now, if you own a company and you are, let's say, 50% or 90% shareholder in that company, you can still be sued. But the point is, you can be sued as an individual. But if your company is sued, and let's say the lawsuit wins and you lose, then it's the company that's going to be held accountable and pay and so on, and be subject to the terms of the negotiated settlement after the lawsuit is finished. You're not going to be paying personally. But remember, there's a difference in the tactics that people use. And so sometimes your company will be sued, and so will you as an individual. Let's say you're the CEO of a company. Your company will be sued, you're responsible, and so you're going to govern yourself accordingly and defend against, the lawsuit. But they might also sue you personally. So I'm going at great length here to discuss the difference between getting sued personally and getting sued in the name of your company. The point is limited liability. Also, contract law, company is subject to whatever it negotiates, but that negotiation, that responsibility does not extend to anybody beyond the company itself. And so an employee of a company working in good faith generally can't be sued or won't be sued. Tactically, as I said, sometimes it does happen that they are sued. But the concept of liability extends to legal and contractual matters. It requires you to think carefully and to analyze carefully and understand, according to the laws of your state in your country or your province in your country, and understand what the consequences are. There are public companies and private companies, but they're all still limited liability companies. A public company would be a publicly traded company whose shares are listed on a stock exchange. Private corporation could be something that you run yourself or that your shareholders and you run in common. A limited liability corporation can be big or small. The largest world corporations, the Fortune 100 or the top 100 companies in the entire world are giant corporations with many subsidiaries of employees, millions and millions of dollars in customer revenue or in capitalization, all the way down to the smallest one-person company that manufactures something very simple and sells it in a very limited local market. The jurisdiction that governs your limited liability corporation could be either national or state or provincial. And so some companies will incorporate under national or federal law, and that gives them rights and authority to do business in many locations, many states or many provinces or many countries. The state or provincial incorporation are more regional in nature, but they still allow you to operate under the rules of business, all the legislation and the laws governing business in your local jurisdiction. It's important to remember that some countries are more favorable to business than others, and that's why you'll find some companies are registered as overseas corporations. I'm thinking of shipping companies. Back in the old days, they used to say that it was a Liberian freighter that, crashed into the dock at some port. And the use of that term indicated that it was a Liberian freighter under Liberian law, very favorable to business. And if I could use the term slack. So that's an example. In some states or provinces, the jurisdiction is more favorable to business. They might have lower fees. They might have more favorable practices to business. They might have a lower taxation rate. They might have lower conditions, lower standards, lower regulatory burden on the company. So it's important when you're considering an LLC where you incorporate, first of all, for reasons of business, and second of all, for reasons of favorability to your company. The rights of a company are to engage in business. There's this liability protection we've talked about, but they are subject to all the rules, regulations, codes, tax rules, employment laws, and so on, and it's a person under the law. So the rights of a corporation are wide-ranging, and they are available to companies in most countries of the world. There are some jurisdictions where the law is more or less favorable. So it is important that you understand the rights of your business in a particular jurisdiction and also how it operates. You would have in a company a set of bylaws that govern the organization and the mission of the company. It's not the same as the mission statement, but there are bylaws that govern certain rules about how your company operates and how it is governed. There is something called a unanimous shareholders agreement. Now, that term varies in different countries, but the point is the unanimous shareholders agreement, or USA, governs the rules of how the shareholders will do business together, how voting occurs, how decisions are made, how somebody can come in or exit, how somebody can buy or sell shares in the company, and so on. So it's important to have information available to yourself about the bylaws and what goes into them. We have templates we can show you if you need to understand some examples of these bylaws. Usually a company has, an LLC will have a board that governs it, and the board is made up of people who might be shareholders, they might not be shareholders, but they are under the law established to govern the company and to set strategy and to set policy. And a board will have officers, so there will be a chair, there'll be a vice chair, there might be committee heads, there might be a compensation committee, there might be a finance committee, there might be a marketing committee, an investment committee. There's all sorts of committees that a board may set up to help it govern. A board also is the final authority in the company. The company may hire staff, so there might be a CEO, there might be a vice president of finance, a vice president of operations, a vice president of marketing, and all sorts of other staff, all the way up to hundreds, thousands, and hundreds of thousands of staff to carry out the work of the company. But the simple structure is always board to govern and set strategy and to set policy, and staff to execute policy. These could be the same people, but not necessarily. A small company might have, let's take an example, 5 shareholders. Let's say 5 people come together. They own a company. They each buy 20% of the shares in the company. They may be the staff of the company. They may also be the board. There may be, the 5 of them may divide up the board responsibilities. And the key difference there is that the board, with its role, acts in a certain way, and then the staff, the administration of the company, with its role, acts in a certain way to carry out the policy set by the board. So if you are the same person as you are a board member and also a staff member, you'd have to understand which hat you're wearing when you speak and with what authority you are speaking. In simple terms, the board sets policy and the staff executes policy. Some interesting points to consider in an LLC. First of all, that firewall effect of which I spoke. That is an important feature because it limits the liability of the company and of the individuals who are shareholders in it. And it is still considered a person of the law, but it's a firewall effect that is actually very powerful in its implementation. It is a person under the law. There's possibility of hierarchically stacking companies. So there could be, if you could imagine some of the org charts that you've probably seen, a corporation might have several corporations under it. It itself might own shares in another company, which in turn might own shares in another company, which in turn might own shares in yet another company. And so there can be a hierarchical stacking of companies. This is possible. Companies don't have to have a name. You often hear of a numbered company, which is simply an off-the-shelf kind of number of a company so that it's designated by a certain name. That doesn't mean that the company is any less effective in what it does, but it does not have to have an identity of its own. And so sometimes you will see the concept of such and such a company limited, DBA, doing business as, and it might have a designation that's a brand, that's marketing available. Example would be the Catholic CEO. That's a company that has a certain name, but it's DBA, the Catholic CEO. And so you will often find this so that a company, and you can trace its lineage all the way up to, the parent company, which might be a numbered company or it might be some other name, as opposed to the name by which consumers generally remember that company or understand it. An LLC has responsibilities to file documentation to stay in operation. There's legal documents that have to be filed annually. Certainly there's tax filings, state and provincial and federal. There's other documentation to regulatory agencies and other groups that govern the work of the company. There are rules and regulations and policies and practices all the way down to the lowest level bylaws that occur in an HOA or in a neighborhood or in a municipality or your town or your city. So an LLC has the duty and the responsibility to be aware of all these things and, of course, to comply. And further responsibility or a right of a corporation is to hire employees or contractors. So they can hire employees who are actually working for the company as employees, and they can hire contractors, which are subcontracted. And those contractors could in turn be companies themselves. And so you have this possible complex or very simple arrangement just depending on the size. So an LLC can be complex or simple, and it can be powerful, large corporation or a tiny little operation. The main features then in summary are this limited liability concept, power to conduct business according to regulations as a separate person under the law, and also the fact that a corporation is governed by a board of directors that does not execute the work, but sets policy, sets strategy, gives directives, and then a staff, whether large or small, that implements that policy, carries it out, and executes the policy. So there you go, a little summary of the LLC, one of the most fundamental, basic legal structures that most businesses are part of. God bless you and your business, and I wish you well with your company, corporation, LLC setup.